Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome the panel and all those who are listening in to our panel at the Watson Institute of Brown University, dedicated to a new book, an important, in fact, path-breaking new book by Ümit Kurt. The book is called The Armenians of Aintab, the Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. And this is the topic of our discussion today. We have a number of distinguished speakers. I will introduce them briefly, and then each of them will speak for about 12 minutes. And then we'll have sufficient time also for discussion. The panel will go on for an hour and a half, so in Eastern Standard Time until 1:30 p.m. So I'll introduce the speakers in the order that they appear on the poster. Our first speaker is Michael Provence, and he is a professor at the Department of History, the University of California, San Diego. He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago. He has lived and studied in Syria, Lebanon, Germany, and France. And he is an author of a book published in 2017, The Great Syrian Revolt, and also has translated, which was translated and widely reviewed in Arabic, Turkish, and American literature. Or publications. Our second speaker is Christine Philliou. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. She is a professor at the Department of History at the University of California, Berkeley. She specializes in the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey and Greece. Her first book, The Ottomans in the Age of Revolution, was published in 2011. And her second book, Turkey, A Past Against History, was published in 2021 and focuses on the opposition dissent in Ottoman and Turkish politics. Our next speaker is Alexander Korb. Alex is an associate professor in modern European history at the University of Leicester and was director of Holocaust and genocide studies between 2012 and 2018. He had numerous fellowships at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, and other places. His research focuses on collaboration and connections between Jews and other groups during the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And his current book project explores the connections between Nazis and their collaborators. Our last speaker is my colleague at the History Department of Brown University, Srimati Mitter. She's the Kutaiba Al-Ghanim, Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern History and International Public Affairs at Brown University. She also has an appointment at the Watson Institute, and she's completing her first book entitled A History of Money in Palestine from the 1900s to the Present, which examines the economic and monetary dimensions of statelessness. And her broader academic interests include economic, social, and political history in the modern Middle East. I will just say also a word about the author whose book we are actually going to discuss today, Ümit Kurt. He is currently at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. He was previously a visiting assistant professor at California State University in Fresno. His PhD is from Clark University, and his current book, which we will be discussing, I do not need to introduce anymore. I would just say one word. I'm also a professor of history at Brown University, and I'm mostly a modern European historian with a growing interest in Israel-Palestine. And without further ado, we'll begin with our first speaker. Michael, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Omer, and thank you, Ümit, for inviting me to this exciting discussion. It's a great pleasure, and I'm a huge fan of this book, The Armenians of Aintab, or Aintab, as it's pronounced in Balad Sham, of which it is part, of course. So this is Greater Syria, and the book is wonderful, and to me, an exemplar of Ottoman, post-Ottoman social and urban history in a way that hasn't been done anywhere for any towns in the region. The town Aintab, Ümit's hometown, is very close to Aleppo. And resembles and was part of the Aleppo province, the Ottoman Aleppo province of Aleppo. So the border between Syria and Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, separated this region in a way that I think, with a kind of a brutality and inhumane consequences, which Ümit defines and shows really, really beautifully. The book is a moving and loving, but very clear-eyed and critical portrait of a prosperous Ottoman provincial town. And it does things that local histories of Ottoman provincial towns typically do not do, which is to track the fortunes of the leading families and where the money came from and where the property came from over the first half of the 20th century. So this is unique, and it's of course, the story is the story of the disestablishment, the destruction, the expulsion, and seizure of assets of the prosperous Armenian community within Aintab, and the shattered hopes of the constitutional revolution or restoration of 1908 for Ottoman citizens, Muslims, Christians, Jews, everybody. And so Ümit does something unique in that he, because of his familiarity with the town, because of his access to archival material that other people have not been able to look at, he's able to find out the property, to discover through deeds, through Armenian archives, through Turkish archives, the basis, the social basis of the post-genocide social and economic construction of the town. He calls it the economy of plunder, of ruling party officials, connected people, and what we might call conflict entrepreneurs of the period of the First World War and immediately after. And the book describes, in a way that I think has never been done before, the legalism of seizure of assets, appropriation, and the use of abandoned property laws in Aintab. And so, I hope, and my questions, and I have questions for Ümit, I want to ask, can this kind of social history be written for other Ottoman towns? And I wonder if it can't even be a model for places perhaps in Central Europe. And I mean, this is a question for the panel, really, for Omer too. I had the strange and wonderful experience of making a dear friend in 1988 in what was then communist Prague in the Czech Republic. And about 3 or 4 years ago, well, a little longer now, I had occasion to visit him again. and we visited him in his holiday house, which was in an abandoned German village in the Czech German borderlands. And he explained to me that his father had been given the house by the communist government in exchange for his good scholarly service as an ethnomusicologist in the early 50s. But this house, unlike all the other houses in the abandoned village, had come with a resident. This house had come with a German. And the German was able to stay in this abandoned village, this destroyed village, because he had shot off his fingers of his right hand, and so was not able to, he couldn't be conscripted into the German army. And so he had this proof of the fact that he hadn't taken part in the war or the genocide. And for this reason, he was allowed to stay in what had been his house and pay rent of 1 chicken a year to the new owners, my friend's father. So this is also the politics of dispossession. And I wonder, I mean, Greater Syria, the region that we're interested here, is full of places where the population has been expelled, where there are victims and refugees and perpetrators and profiteers, full. And to go back to Aleppo, we could say for certain that right now, there are grand houses in Aleppo occupied by Syrian army officers who have been given those homes from the government that has stolen them from the older inhabitants, some of whom were probably Armenians, who are now refugees in Turkey. Irony of ironies. So all of this is to say, can we take this, and can we, and secondarily, of course, how unique is the story of Aintab, and how much can we generalize it to the experience of the miserable experience of the 20th century, and unfortunately the early 21st century in this region, in the post-imperial region of Central Europe, the Habsburg lands, the Ottoman lands, and so on. And of course, I mean, can we say, could someone write a history like this to take an example, I think kind of obvious example, for Jerusalem, where Ümit is speaking to us. And I think that, I hope that it's possible, and I think that this is something that we can hopefully look forward to, and that Ümit has provided a guide, a way to do this in a courageous and responsible and clear-eyed, but also humane and loving way, because it is his town and he loves it, and it comes out on every page, and this is a beautiful thing. So can we have a discussion about, in the fully nuanced way, about the long 19th century and its victims and its wars, its perpetrators, its refugees, without too much reference to national histories and the struggles of identity, both in the past and in the contemporary period. So this is what, to me, this is what Ümit has shown to be possible. And so I'm, thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. And of course, what you're talking about is not only history, it's also very present for millions of people who are still living under these conditions or with these memories. Thank you. Well, we'll continue now to Christine. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations, Ümit. I agree. I couldn't agree more with everything Michael said. It's clear-eyed, wonderfully written, and disturbing and chilling for the same reason, right? It's unflinching. And I read it as a fellow traveler in many senses, partly in that my grandparents bore witness to some of, not Aintab itself, but related events to the genocide as they were being deported as Greeks in 1915. And as a fellow traveler, as I've been watching WATS, the Workshop in Armenian and Turkish Studies, as I watched it unfold as a grad student and young scholar. And I watched this whole mission or enterprise of Turks and Armenians and others coming together to try to really write a grounded, empirical, integrated history of the genocide. And as we all know, there are pioneers that came before Ümit, but this really, I think, is an important turning point, this book. So of course, there's the Taner Akçam, there's Ron Suni, who wrote the kind of synthetic work summing up what had been achieved in scholarship up to the centennial in 2015. And there have been a couple other sort of partial local studies, but I do think this is a kind of a watershed book. And it, in being a thorough, like we said, an empirical study of not just about the loss of life, but about property and about the kind of sinews of state and society that are implicated in this process, using Ottoman and Armenian sources, which I think is unusual. There's the kind of the Raymond Kevorkian, like the cataloging, this kind of encyclopedic knowledge about what happened in each of these localities. But the thing that I think is, one of the things that I think is so important about this book is that it brings us from a discussion of numbers to names. Right? You have this long appendix in the back of the specific Armenian names, the families. These were humans, right? It's a very humanizing approach to this, right? It's not, it is in one sense about money. You're talking about property and livelihoods and dispossession and confiscation, but these are humans that are being dispossessed. And I think that is one thing that just makes it both extremely eye-opening and also just emotionally difficult to read, because we have to empathize with these people. It's not just nameless victims. And that is, it's something I think quite unique about this book. I appreciated the economics of it and the political economy. Again, it's rare and it's difficult because it has been difficult to get at the sources until recently. So that is an accomplishment in and of itself, to actually systematically trace the assets and the laws promulgated to confiscate those assets and the erasure of the process after the fact. The book is poetic in its own way, in that the erasure is, documented in the past, and then we see the results of it in the present. The erasure was so thorough that even Ümit could live the first 21 years of his life in that town and not even be aware of the presence of that community, right? And that is also just it's chilling and it's moving at the same time. The other thing that kept coming to mind, and after reading Ümit's book, I also read The 40 Days at Musadag over the summer and a bunch of testimonials of genocide survivors. And I have to say, one thing that also really hit home is that we've come to talk about the genocide similarly to the Holocaust as if it was one event. And it actually, it was really, especially in this book and in The 40 Days of Musadag, you understand that it was a countless series of acts and events and violations and erasures. And it's a whole space. It's really a whole history unto itself. And as important as it is to have a word to describe this genocide, I also think there's a way in which it does us a disservice, because we are able to use this shorthand and it allows us to pass over the brutal details that Ümit gives us in this book. And the details are extremely important to understanding what this was, what it meant for the people who perpetrated it, and the people who denied it after the fact. And it's honestly, as a human, it's difficult to believe, but it happened. And so this book is extremely important as documentation of that. And just this, in terms of Ottoman historiography, I found it to be a very nuanced treatment of the state mechanisms that facilitated this process. that there's an understanding of the local actors in the government and the local elites, the bourgeoisie, and it's not just a black and white situation of an order being handed down and people are machines. There are these intricate relationships, and that is, when I teach this period, that is one of the things I try to convey to students, that the Ottoman Empire at this moment was very hybrid, or very kind of difficult to classify state formation, in that it had these kind of certain features of a modern state in terms of certain kinds of technologies or certain kinds of organization of law and administration, and yet it was really operating on the fly in a very pre-modern sense of informal power structures going on at the same time. And that's what makes it very hard to kind of classify what's going on, and for students these days to get their heads around it. But I think that you capture that nuance and that complexity really beautifully. I don't actually have questions. I would love to hear what other people have to say. I would echo though Michael's question about where we go now and whether you see this as a case study, because I would see it definitely as a case study and a building block for people to work on other localities and to see what the patterns are. I also have been recently very fascinated with like the spatial turn and the visual turn in like digital humanities, and I think it would be amazing to try to visualize this data and this process that you're doing. And I would imagine it would connect up if we did like a linked database, these names would probably connect up with other localities as well. And that would be an amazing kind of collaborative project that could happen. But for now, that question of the uniqueness or not of Aintab, I think would be fascinating to hear from you about. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks so much. And we move now to Alex. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Omer. Thank you for the invitation to that fascinating book presentation here. I'm honored to be here. I'm speaking to you from Leicester in England, from an empty classroom where I just finished my class, and England is under snow, so that's a rare moment in time here. My honor is to comment on Ümit's book from a Central Europeanist's perspective, and I'm a scholar of the Holocaust here at the University of Leicester, namely of the Holocaust in Central and Eastern Europe, and I've been studying the Yugoslavia during the Second World War, in order to find out how the Holocaust was intertwined with the genocide of other groups, namely of Roma and Serbs in occupied Yugoslavia during the Second World War. And of course, the book is a striking eye-opener if you kind of start mentally comparing the case of Aintab and of all the locations that have been affected by genocide during the Second World War, whether it's cities like Buhac or whether it's cities like Karlovac in Croatia. Of course, the comparative questions just start popping up. So to answer Michael's initial question, of course, this story could be told maybe in different forms and ways and with different sort of chapters and stories, but all over Eastern Europe. And of course, Ümit also admits that he benefits greatly from the historiography of the Holocaust. So the scholars Ümit is quoting in his intro are, of course, kind of the pioneers of scholarship of Aryanization, of Robbing the Jews by Martin Dean, and other authors who, also from Germany, like Philipp Thaer and Konstantin Goschler, who have really broken a pathway into conceptual questions. How do we study robbery, and how does it link to genocide, and when and how does robbery turn lethal? Nevertheless, it's of course an under-researched subject when we look at the Holocaust. when we look at the number of other cases, and I have kind of tried to look a little bit up the historiography of cases like Bosnia of the 1990s or the Rwandan case, and we still know so little about the ways how expropriation and spoliation have looked like, and how redistribution and restitution after the fact, of course, have looked like, how incomplete they were, what the patterns were, let alone comparative questions. So there is no scholarship that links Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and other cases where questions of the economic side of genocides are concerned. So this is an open new field, and of course studies like the ones on Aintab are extremely important, but they also make us realize how huge the gaps are and how much work has to be done. I, however, was reminded of similarities that kind of open up the dialogue between the Armenian case and any other case of genocide that took place in Eastern Central Europe during the 20th century. And let me just very briefly address 4 phases of economic genocide in a chronological order, and talk a little bit about the similarities. I think it's really important to maybe distinguish a little bit, and that's what, of course, Ümit does in his book, between the different rationales and between the different levels of perpetratorhood. So when we talk about redistribution and expropriation of property, which is orchestrated from above, where the state is the main kind of looter, we are often talking about the state that targets minorities, often wealthy and urban communities, whether it's Jews or Armenians or ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe, where they play a significant economic role in larger and mid-sized cities. And in that case, expropriation often comes before lethal violence. There is a state-run program that targets minority economically, and the expropriation as such has a radicalizing effect on the persecution, because what happens next is that the state then faces an impoverished minority without many means, without an economic significance, and the expropriation had that radicalizing effect in the sort of long run of the genocide. However, it was, of course, the state that targeted the minority, not only for economic reasons, but the economy was the starting chapter of that onslaught on a minority. Of course, on a local level, and that's the second point here, the picture is completely different. In places like in Jedwabne, where massacres break out, where neighbors often target their minority neighbors, and the examples that come to mind are mainly from the Holocaust. The motives might have been economic in the first place, but the expropriation often follows the lethal violence. It's following a massacre, and the redistribution takes place after a massacre. And I think this is a very, very local phenomenon. And here often bystanders or people who were not part of the lethal violence get drawn into the redistribution process. That's a bit different with the first example that I gave, where there is often a pool of applicants, it's often party confidants who benefit from expropriation. Here, of course, on a local level, it can just be a peasant who has to take then care of the cow of his former neighbor who had been murdered, or who then starts plowing the fields or continuing the work that his neighbor had started. So a very different pattern when we look at the local scenario. However, what's most important, I think, if we look at European schemes of changing demographies is that expropriation went hand in hand with grand demographic schemes, population exchanges or population transfers that, well, might have started as ethnic cleansing programs. They became genocidal in some cases, in some cases they did not. But here, resettlement went hand in hand with huge schemes to redistribute minorities' lands and their mobile property, whether it's population exchanges between Turkey and Greece, or Turkey and Bulgaria, Romania and Bulgaria, Bulgaria and Greece. And here, of course, maybe a question for Ümit would be whether officials in Aintab had earlier examples of population exchanges and large-scale dispossession in mind, whether they have learned anything from their predecessors on that field. So in my country case study, Yugoslavia, of course, huge agencies are being formed to try to organize the dispossession on a professional level as grand as possible, and they also always have plans in mind how to improve local agriculture, how to socially alter, even uplift a local society. Most of those plans, of course, fail, mostly bloodily. However, planning and practice are very much intertwined here. And what comes last and fourth is, of course, the aftermath of a genocide, the return of the survivors, questions of restitution on a very local level. Often the survivors knock at the door of their previous house. That's what often explains new rounds of violence, what Jan Grabowski has described for Poland, sort of preventive killings of returnees, economically and not ideologically motivated. And I learned from him in his book that indeed 335,000 survivors of the Armenian genocide returned into Anatolia in 1918. And thanks to local studies such as this one, we know a little bit about it. But for Yugoslavia, we know nothing. We don't know how the state reacted to survivors returning and claiming back their society. And interestingly, in Yugoslavia, the state was a little bit, well, not indifferent, but didn't really find out how to deal with that. And in theory, being sympathetic with the survivors, who were often persecuted as communists. In practice, however, often the perpetrators and the beneficiaries got away with their theft. So this is really it. Maybe one question for Ümit relating to that moment in 1918, whether there was actually sort of a window, of course, after the genocide, and it would be wrong to speak of healing or reconciliation, but was there a short window for undoing what has been done during the genocide? And you call it a flawed restitution, of course. But if there was an opportunity, when did that window close again, and why and how? So thanks for a great and stimulating book, which my students started using already as I speak in this classroom. And thanks to you all.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for a very interesting sort of set of questions and observations. And we move now to Srimati. Srimati, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Ümit, especially for writing this incredible book. Thank you, Omer, for inviting me to be part of this panel. It is really such an honor also just to see all of you on the screen, because you're all people I've read and admired and hero worshipped. So I feel utterly sort of a bit shell-shocked to be even in this Zoom room with Christine and Michael especially. So I'm going to start with actually where Ümit's book starts, with the Papyrus Cafe, because I think it was such a moving beginning. And it took me really, Michael has also already mentioned this, but it really took me back to the time that I've spent in Jaffa and Jerusalem in present day Israel, particularly in Jaffa. You have the same idea of these elegant old buildings. The beauty and the elegance of these buildings is key to the story. And they're devoid of the people who built them, who were responsible for this elegance. But their worth is very, very important because they're beautiful. And that is something that, your opening actually mentions, is this beauty and this related to that, this willful ignorance and blindness about who it belongs to. And that, I think, it goes to the heart of what I think both all of you have said, which is the comparative aspect of this. This is at once a very painful, personal, local story, but the comparisons to all these places that we study are so evident, and certainly to me, the clearest comparison is to the Israeli narrative, the urban architecture of Israel today. So that, I think, is where I wanted to start. But of course, as Michael has already said, this is very much a broader story of the Middle East in World War I. And here I just want to say how much I appreciate that the story of property confiscation is very much, it has been studied in the World War I context, but mainly in the European context. This is the story of, World War I leading up to World War II, which is the Allied confiscations using enemy property laws of German and Austro-Hungarian property. And this is something that I've come across in my own research, that to the extent that property is part of World War I story, it is that story, European story. What is wonderful about this book is it brings the Ottoman Empire, and particularly the Arab part of, because Aintab is really, it's right there on the border. And what I've found in my own research is that very similar things were happening in Palestine under the British at exactly the same moment, a little bit after. So in 1917, when the British take over Palestine during that stage in the war, they actually use enemy property legislations to confiscate Ottoman property, particularly Ottoman institutions. So the comparative aspects of this are not only just the broader ones that Alex has referred to, but also it's happening at the same time. This is part of what it means to be at war. And I think that is what this book really makes clear. I think the difference is that here, the economic plunder and confiscation, and I'll talk a bit later about what words can be used. The difference here is the genocidal aspect, which you don't have happening in the British occupation of Palestine at the same time. And I think that's what makes the story at once part of a comparative conversation, but also very different from that World War I conversation. And secondly, on the World War I story, in addition to the story of economic plunder and dispossession being very much so far a Eurocentric story, the World War I story for the Middle East has very much been about state formation in the Middle East. This is the moment of mandates and then the Arab states. And what Umit's work really makes clear, particularly that last chapter, is that what are the foundations of these modern states? It's not just the political sort of mess of the chaos of the end of the Ottoman Empire, but the economic foundation. Which states are strong economically and which states are weak and flounder? It goes back to the story of plunder. So one of the very clear things that you say, Umit, is that there is supposed to be a break, right, between the Ottoman past and the Republican, creation of modern Turkey. And what you're saying is that actually it's the elites, the new elites who profited from all of this. There is no break, that they became elites, or they were already elites, but they became wealthier by profiting from this moment. And they're the ones who took on the reins of the new state of modern Turkey. So this supposed break between Republican and Ottoman is something that I think you're complicating. And again, I'm not at all a historian either of Ottoman Turkey or of modern Turkey. But again, this brings me to think about the Israeli case, that Israel emerges in 1948. It's a later story, but it emerges as a relatively wealthy, not very wealthy, but relatively wealthy story compared to Jordan, Iraq, Syria. And what are the foundations of that wealth? To a great extent, it's the plunder, the kinds of plunder that you describe in your work. So that is it for the comparative thing. I'll just turn my comments now to very quickly on two things that really, really struck me about your book. One is the lists, and the second is the laws. I want to talk about the lists briefly because they're so harrowing. I think Christine used the word chilling, moving and chilling. And really, it's reading those lists that I had, and I have it now. I have goosebumps on my hands because the lists, they're so detailed, and it's true what Christine said, that this is a story about people.
I think we lost Rimati. She's frozen. Let's just wait 1 sec. Maybe she can unfreeze. I don't know if you can hear us, Rimati. That is the problem of doing things on Zoom. Well, I think we don't have a choice right now, but to maybe we'll get back to Srimati.
I'm back. I don't know.
Back. You're back. Okay.
I don't know what happened. I got bumped out. Or maybe the Israelis are not appreciating my...
Someone interfered.
Maybe I should have toned down my comparative. Okay, I don't know how much you heard, but I said I wanted to talk about the lists and the laws. I don't know if you heard that. On the lists, I just wanted to say I appreciate what Christine had said about this is really a story about the people, not of the things, but the things themselves are so incredibly moving. And I went through this Jacobian list, and there it's literally, it's bedding, it's hand embroidered silk clothes, it's books from the Catholic Church, it's bath basins, laundry boilers, 7 rugs, a child's pillow. And when you start putting those things together, you start imagining that child whose pillow it was. And that's where I think, my goosebumps really, out of control. So the lists are really, really important. Besides being incredibly moving, I think they help illustrate, 2 parts of your argument. One is that this is a class story, that the victims are actually really wealthy. These are social and economic elites. They have things like 7, rugs and, embroidered clothes. And it is clear that while the othering of the Armenians has often, and I think correctly, been understood as a political story, right? And as a religious story. They're Christians, they're maybe not, they're maybe not to be trusted. There's the Russian story, there's the whole Balkan story. But here it's also, these are wealthy people. And we want their nice things. And I think the lists really help solidify that understudied aspect of the Armenian genocide, that we want their bath basins. So that's one, I think, really important contribution of that very detailed, painstaking work that you do. And the other thing about the lists is that the perpetrators list is the buyers list. That in many cases you match them up, and that itself it's such an incredible work of, I think, detection that, okay, this is how I prove that whole larger argument about this is the foundation of the future state of Turkey, is that the names match. Not all of them, but the fact that you have perpetrators in one list and buyers in the other, and you have this Ahmed, whatever his name is, Aga, who gets those 7 rugs. I think for me, this is the work of detection that is so important and original to this work. And on the perpetrators, I just wanted to say I really loved the bit, probably because my own work is really interested in banks. I really loved, although loved is not the right word for any of this. It's like, if you hate it, but I was really taken by the story of the Ottoman bank guy. Who is this guy? This guy called Leon, what's his name? Leon Reyhan, who's clearly, this is not a Turkish person, who, as Ümit shows in chapter 4, he's actively encouraging the Armenians to put their valuables in the Aintab branch of the Ottoman Bank, basically saying that this is how you keep it safe. And my feeling, Ümit, I don't know if this is wrong, but certainly in Palestine, in the Ottoman Bank, a lot of the management were Armenians. at least in the Palestinian branches. So I wonder if that was the case in the Aintab branch. Whatever it is, there's a story of trust here, that we trust this institution, and whoever this manager is, whatever his nationality, he's encouraging Armenians to keep your stuff here, we'll keep it safe. And then the moment they're deported, he forms a company with other Muslim elites, and he basically sells all their stuff. So this is a story that is so incredibly outrageous, but it's so vivid. And it also points to the fact that the perpetrators aren't just, you say they're the local elites and the neighbors and the Ottoman, central government, but here it's another perpetrator, which is Ottoman Bank is a British, well, not yet, it is British-French at this point, institution. And the manager who instead of being aghast at what is happening to his colleagues and his customers is actively involved in that. So that's all I'll say about the list. I know I'm out of time, but I just wanted to say about, because I was cut off, I hope I can have one more minute. I wanted to talk about the laws, because I think that is a really other important aspect of this work. And there's, a lot that can be said about the legalization of this theft, which I think other people have alluded to. But I think I was really struck by a couple of things. One is the language of temporality in the laws, that this is a temporary thing. This concept of restitution, that I think that's part of legitimizing this thing, that we're not just passing a law saying this is illegal, but we're just saying this is a small thing, and when you come back, and there's all this language about, oh, there's the fair value that will be exchanged. And I was really struck that it's not just the legitimation of law that is happening here, but it's the legitimation of these norms of finance. That, there's all this language you use, the equivalent value will be given to Armenians. The idea that there will be a public auction, right? This is capitalism. We have a free market. We'll auction these things, then we'll keep that money. But in fact, it's not a public auction at all. Everything's rigged, and the prices are rigged so that so-and-so, Hussein Aga, whatever, can buy the stuff. And what is really interesting, it's a minor detail, but I think it proves the point, which is that the first thing they do, even before they start confiscating Armenian property, is that they go around collecting all the debts and all the receivables that the Armenians own. So let's get rid of them. We'll take that property, but before they go, we'll collect anything that they owe. And it's sort of the greed and the smallness that's encapsulated in that, I think, explains the larger story. And that this is not a fog of war story by any means, and Umit's work makes that absolutely clear. But really just that detail, that before you go, pay the 2 or whatever lira that you owe, otherwise, we'll track you down. But never mind about all your property that, somehow later you'll be given back. So I think it's really the lists and the laws that I wanted to highlight as I think very striking aspects of this work. I think I've put in some questions already in my comments. One question I did have was this character of Ephraim Jernazian, because I was fascinated by the fact that you said there's this Armenian person who was acting as the interpreter to one of these commissions. And I was just sort of saying, okay, so this is how it worked. There were Armenians involved. So that was one question which you may or may not want to answer because it's a detail, but who is this person? And the second question was a larger question, which is, what word do we use for this thing? There have been many words that all of you have mentioned. And of course, you refer to this big book, Robbing the Jews. So the word robbing is there, but you don't use that word. You use economic plunder, you use confiscation, you use spoilage. So I'm just wondering, what word, is there a word that can be used when this is at once, as I've said, what's happening in World War I? The British are doing the same thing in Palestine, but it's not. Because it does, here's the other part, which is the deportation, the people story, which is what makes it unique. And I suppose I should really end there because I'm out of time. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Srimati. Very thought-provoking comments. We're going to move now to Ümit. I just want to tell those listening that if they have questions, please write them on the Q&A. And after Ümit's response, I will try to read some of them out for the panel. So Ümit, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for all these remarkable and eye-opening comments. All of them is really broadening my horizon, and so nice and honored to hear these significant point of views, constructive critiques from prominent historians whose work have greatly sway on my work, actually. So it's really such a great honor to be with you discussing my book and dissecting various aspects of it, which actually you have done it pretty well, better than I did in the book. So I truly appreciate it. So I was being warned by Professor Bartov for not speaking longer than 12 minutes. So I will keep it as short as possible and try to answer all your questions and comments. So beforehand, I would like to touch upon a few conceptual remarks before zooming in on Aintab, actually. So, you know, there is this primordialist atmosphere that has been out there while talking about violence. So I believe writing about violence with an awareness of its embeddedness in a specific historical time and place purges it of the primitive aura, let's say, that has surrounded it, an aura that has long tarnished our understanding of the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East, let's say. So, for instance, there is this rich literature on the urban notables in Ottoman and Arab cities from the 18th to middle of the 20th century, has provided a comprehensive and fascinating view of the political organization of urban society from local, imperial, and national perspectives, but has offered only occasional glimpses of the violent social worlds of local leaders, entrepreneurs of violence, let's say, and their followers for sure. So we hail them as perpetrators, let's say, so we call them. So my work in that sense tries to fill that kind of gap. So I would like to start with Professor Provence's question about can this kind of social history be written for other towns? So here, actually, the main argument of my work and this book is that locality matters. Locality does really matter in order to fathom and also explain different aspects of the destruction of Armenians. Whether you term it genocide, it's another discussion of topic. It is genocide, but what we are talking about a political violence, a mass violence incident in the Ottoman Empire and in the Middle East. So I think the same kind of work can be done for other provinces too. So this kind of work enables us to understand social dynamics of violence. So as Professor Bartov has beautifully also done in the case of Buchach. So these social dynamics also tell us why genocide or that kind of exterminatory violence occur in the case of Aintab, let's say, or in the case of eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire, Western Armenia, why it did not occur in other places, let's say before 1915, why it happened in 1915. So that also makes me revisit this notion of restraint of violence. In order to understand why genocide happened in Aintab, I would like to understand now what were the cases for restraint of violence to understand the whole larger picture. So we need more regional works, more regional studies in the case of Armenian genocide. So we lay way behind, Holocaust, Rwandan genocide, and Khmer Rouge genocide, and other genocidal violence in Yugoslavia and in different parts of the world. So what makes Aintab distinguishing is that economic motivations were so concrete, especially from the perspective of local elites, provincial notables, ayans in Ottoman, in Turkish, and also as well as other active perpetrators of this violence. So onlookers, bystanders, and also active perpetrators, ordinary Muslim civilians, Arabs, Kurds, Circassians, very small number of Circassians, and the other Balkan refugees from Crete and also Balkans. They were also relocated and resettled in Aintab too. So this kind of work provides us certain kinds of insights to show that then genocide or that kind of mass violence is a social process. It is a process, but it has a number of social dynamics among the neighbors, between the diverged ethno-religious societies, and so on and so forth. So, and also another distinguishing aspect of Aintab is that local participation and was so fervent, so concrete, so palpable in the case of genocide, and it goes that far. It goes even further, that local elites in Aintab convince central authorities, the Ottoman ruling government, Committee of Union and Progress, to make deportation decision taken for Aintab. So the local authorities were more willing, more enthusiastic, and were more zealot than the central authorities, who were the main orchestrator of the destruction of Armenians, especially in eastern provinces. But in the case of Cilicia, first and foremost in Aintab, these kind of active and fervent participation of provincial notables were much more vocal and outrageous in the case of Aintab, I would say. And also, from the perpetrator's perspective, this work provides us, to a certain extent, to show that actually ethnic hatred or ethnic differences do not play that pivotal role. Also, ethnic nationalism, I'm including that aspect as well, in the destruction of Armenians. So these kind of differences, this kind of ethnic hatred were, of course, they were dynamics, but they were not the main or major dynamics which led to violence, because it's really it depends on the episode. It varies from episode to episode, moment to moment, and certain perpetrators act like a perpetrator at some point, and in other episode they act like rescuers. So the fault lines were really fickle and hazy and murky in the case of Aintab too. Of course, you know, these kind of arguments sound quite familiar for a Holocaust historian, but in our field, these kind of findings are quite new. So I really want my colleagues to get used to hearing those kind of, you know, argumentation as well. So in order to substantiate these economic motivations, our main problem is lack of not lack of sources. Sources are out there, especially. So in this book, I came up with a report of an abandoned liquidation commission. So it's the first of its kind. I just incidentally, you know, just found this report. Some Sarkis Yakupian's, you know, descendants living in Los Angeles. They just invited me for dinner, and then all of a sudden, this sweet lady, you know, brought a box of documents and just poured in front of me, and all of a sudden, this report Castanaya, you know, and then I realized all of a sudden, oh my God, it was an auction result of the properties, especially movable properties, which belonged to Sarkis Yakupian, her great-grandfather. So abandoned property commissions, which were transformed into abandoned property liquidation commissions, tasfiye komisyonları, they were founded in 34, 35 provinces of the Ottoman Empire in Asia Minor. Aintab was one of them, Aleppo was one of them too. So their records were preserved and kept, and those records are available in the archives, but inaccessible for researchers. So we cannot reach out these sources, these records. And I spent almost 1.5 years in the Prime Minister Ottoman Archives in Istanbul for 6 to 7 months each and every day. I requested these files. I asked about their presence and so forth. The archivist, very nice, very polite guy, he told me, you know, we have them, but we have not classified them yet. So which indicates, so these records do exist. So in order to make Aintab not unique, let's say, you know, so we need these sources available, because the same commissions were founded in the province of Kayseri, in province of Izmit, in province of Bursa, and Harput, Mamerutulaziz, I mean, so all these places. therefore, this liquidation report also indicates political and economic interests of these elites converged in all these, social political explosion, which found channel through violence. And what else? So to respond to Alex, actually, when you look at the Russian case, the Tsarist Russia during the World War I, the liquidation laws and regulation the Russian Empire promulgated were exactly almost the same with the ones of the Ottoman Empire. So there is this parallel and a number of patterns in terms of confiscating and liquidating enemy alien citizens of the Tsarist Russia, Germans, Poles, Jews, Tatars, and so on and so forth. So exactly the same kind of process was taking place in Tsarist Russia just a couple of months before the Union and Progress Party initiated the process. The temporary deportation law even was like a carbon copy of the deportation law promulgated by Tsarist Russia. So Eric Lohr's this important book, Nationalizing the Empire, is an exemplary work for indicating that aspect too. And also window of reconciliation or restitution process. Restitution process was initiated. Immediately aftermath of the war, Ottoman Empire was defeated, Mondros armistice was signed, and then in late 1918 and early 1919, Armenians who managed to survive began to return to their homelands. And of course, their homelands were mostly occupied or sold out in the auctions and so forth. And most of them were occupied by the refugees coming from the Caucasian and Balkan regions immediately aftermath of 1912 and 1913. So these created a huge and tumultuous atmosphere and climate in so many provinces. Aintab was one of them, but restitution was really started, and a number of Armenians who managed to survive or their descendants, they start to take their properties back. But this process was halted when the Kemalist liberation movement in Ankara started in late 1919, became the upper hand. And when aftermath of the victory of the Kemalist government in Ankara vis-a-vis against the Greek occupied forces, and then as of 1922, in Grand National Assembly in Ankara, these restitution laws were rescinded. And when the Lausanne was approaching in Turkey, in Lausanne promised to give all these properties back to their real owners. But in domestic affairs, they were revising the laws and regulations, and these laws and regulations were exactly the CUP liquidation laws. So they were revising these laws in order to obstruct Armenians from claiming their properties back. And so this window of reconciliation, restitution actually came to a halt after 1922, let's say. As a response to Sirimati, as for, in this work, actually, of course, I explained how the destruction process was carried out, all the performative aspect of violence, physical violence, and so forth. But in this work, I particularly focus on these legal papers. Their code language, positivistic language, in order to show that we can explain this total annihilation by focusing on these legal papers. So, that's why I also invite scholars and my colleagues to revisit the notion of genocide, to think about it, not from the physical violence as point of view, but also this how one society, one group of people, one group of nation or race, how these groups could be turned into a civilian death through these so-called legal rules and regulations, and how all these plunder, liquidation, appropriations were carried out in concocted ways under the veneer of legality. So CUP leaders, the Ottoman ruling elite, these people, they were obsessed with this legalism because they were not, they did not want that this robbery became obvious. This robbery, transpired. So in order to conceal the state robbery, they also they did not want plunder in so many places. They also regulated laws and regulations and some sanction, also in order to deter people from plundering these properties, because the state always wanted to keep the lion's share in their pocket. But CUP needed social support, recruitment. So they used plunder, and they condoned so many plunder incidents in so many provinces, including Aintab, in return for social consent and support in distracting or orchestrating Armenian genocide in the provinces. So the legal aspect, this legalism, was essential for them to conceal their stealing, basically. So I think I must stop here so I can continue, but we maybe get some more questions. Thank you so much for all these wonderful comments, eye-opening comments, and it gives me a lot of meat for further work, actually, as well. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ümit. There are a number of questions. I just want to take the privilege of moderating this event and just touch on a couple of issues that were raised. Maybe we can also talk a little bit about that within the panel itself. I mean, I think one thing that was referred to by I think most of the commentators is that this sort of combines, your book combines a local history with a personal history, with a history that has to do with property. And I think that's a very interesting combination. To me, this of course raised a whole lot of issues, as you know, because my own experience was coming to a place that was erased. And in that sense, what your book talks about is history. It talks about memory, but not only memory of what is remembered, but also of erasure, and then of the politics of it all. What is remembered and what is erased, of course, has to do with memory. My own personal experience was of coming to a place that I knew had been one thing, but there was no memory of it there. That memory had been erased, even though some of the material remnants were still there. And I wondered how people live in a place where they know, or they should know, that some of these material remains had belonged to someone else, or they may even be living in them. And it was only as a result of that I began thinking of where I myself had grown up, and that I too had grown up living with the remnants of what had been there before. So one of them was in Eastern Europe and one of them was in Israel, and I'd grown up surrounded by remains of Arab villages right where I was living. And that sort of connection between looking at the local and the personal is, I think, what brings us much closer to the idea of genocide, that in some ways is so inhuman and is so distancing that all we can say is we can't understand it. It's impossible to understand. In fact, it's completely possible to understand on that personal level. So this was one thing that I thought I really wanted to bring out. The second is this issue of property, because you learn both that genocide on the local level is also always about property. Now, it's both personal and about property, but property plays a very important role. And there I just wanted to sort of respond to what Alex was saying. I think, at least on the local level where I saw it, it was both. That is, the population wants the property, But the state, like in the case of Buchach, also comes and packs it up nicely, or has other people pack it up for it, and then sends it to the homeland for use by the state. And the population gets the lesser type of property, and the property that cannot be moved. And the last thing that occurred to me, because of your last, it's not the last chapter, but the chapter that you were referring to now, and I actually raised that with my class too, I'm teaching a class on genocide, is that ironically what happens is that at the end of the war, the area of your town is occupied by the British. And it is under the British occupation that the return of the surviving Armenians is possible, and it facilitates the beginning of restitution, which of course is then, as you just said, is ended with the Kemalist victory. And so here you have a moment where occupation or intervention can actually make a difference. It makes a difference in the sense that those who occupy have a different interest, and they actually allow the return, although temporarily, of the survivors of genocide and robbery. So that's just a few sort of random thoughts that I had on this. And I'm going now to, I don't know if you can see the questions, but I'm going to just raise a number of them, and maybe you can respond, but also other panelists, because some of these questions are addressed to other panelists in the time that we have remaining. The first question is from Lisa Basumian, and she thanks you for writing the book. She of course, it means a great deal to her family. She says, we have so little information on what happened to my grandparents before they fled Aintab. I found their home on map 2, and just seeing the outline of that building brought the reality of their ordeal to light. My cousins and I have always wanted to know how it is that my family managed to stay there until 1922-3. So that's a very specific question. Can you respond in any way to that?
Sure. By the way, Sirmati was also referring to the list of properties. Sirmati list was longer than the one in the book, but because of pagination problem, and we just only identified the intensely populated area of Aintab Armenians, the Armenian quarter of the city, and we managed to put over 50 kind of locations, which I pinpoint the trajectory and history of the properties. But my list was almost my list consisted of 464 locations I pinpointed in the city. So Lisa Barsumian, I personally know her too. So Barsumian family, by the way, it was one of the leading and prominent and wealthy families in the city, quite philanthropist and intellectual and supporting education, and they contributed the foundation of a number of Armenian schools in the city. And Barsumian family also established a school on their name, Barsumian School we had. And so the departure of Aintab Armenians from the city as a total departure, let's say, it did not happen all at once. It was a process. So it depended on the course of war between the Kemalist forces and also the local national forces in the city supporting alongside and sided with Kemalist forces, and also French troops, because after British occupation, French troops came to town in October 1919, and also there was a Légion d'Orient within the French troops. So, and this Légion d'Orient was consisted of Armenian soldiers. It evoked and led to and garnered so many provocations in the Muslim side. Actually, it was the main motivation for also Muslims to support Kemalist forces logistically and financially, the way in which they were reluctant in the beginning. So when the war was ongoing between these French troops and the Kemalist forces, some Armenians, of course, they were scared, they were worried about, and they were scared of the fact that the same kind of destruction would happen again. So they did not want to stay in the city, although they were also supporting French forces, and they created their own self-defense mechanisms as well in the city. They bravely fought. But when they realized, that things were getting worse, and they were worried about the fact that the same kind of consequence would happen to them. So they decided to leave the city as of 1921. So the last Armenians who were forced to leave the city in late 1923. So there were still almost 36 Armenian families in the town up until 1923. And according to first official population census of Turkish Republic, which was carried out in 1927, there were still over 20 Armenians living in the city. So it could happen. So it could be possible.
Thank you. So now we have a question. I'm going to raise these two questions together, and then you and also the other panelists can respond. The first question by Theodore Bogosian is: has this splendid work made you persona non grata anywhere? And that's an interesting question for an historian. And the second question by Fethi Kelesh is: thanks for this intriguing panel. I was wondering if the author and/or panelists would offer their take on the constitutive, potentially at least, role, not of remembering, but instead of forgetting, in the eventual formation of an era, an aura of reconciliation. And I like this question very much because that's something that I was also alluding to. So maybe if you don't mind, let's start with the rest of the panel, and then we'll get back to you, Ümit.
Sure.
So anyone who wants to respond to that.
So I can say maybe a word on Fethi's question before handing back to the others. So in my view, of course, remembering, redistributing or restituting and reconciliating goes hand in hand, and there is not the one without the other, even though if you look back in history, sometimes restitution actually goes hand in hand with attempts to forget. So the German money, hush money basically paid to Israel in the 1950s was of course not an attempt to remember. It was an attempt to put an end to the past. So of course, I think restitution is the weakest element of the three here. However, we can learn a great deal from the patchy and incomplete attempts to restitute Holocaust victims, but we need to learn, and there can't be reconciliation without attempts to make good for what has been stolen. So my hope is that lessons will be learned. Of course, in most cases, it's too late. We can't restitute people who have passed away many, many years ago. And here, of course, the debate of colonialism kicks in, and colonial restitution, which by now focuses very much on museums. But actually, last year, the German government started considering to pay the Society of Survivors and their the surviving societies of Herero in Namibia, of course. And we have to consider that these societies who have been victimized by genocide are still hugely disadvantaged. They wouldn't be as poor as they are today if it wasn't for the genocide. So the Germans were very reluctant to call it an apology, and so reconciliation isn't there quite yet. And they are very reluctant to call it a restitution, but they arrived at the conclusion that money must be transferred. It's not ideal, but it's a step in the right direction.
I can also answer that very similar. I agree with very much what Alex has said, but I would also say in the Armenian case and in the Palestinian case, which is the one I work on, these are stories that have officially not even been recognized, right? We still can't even talk about the Armenian genocide in Turkey. You know, this is related to the other one. I'm actually curious, Umit, can you even go back to Turkey, or what kind of official welcome do you receive? I was joking about me being cut off by the Israelis, but these things exist. Those of us we're not talking about something that happened in the past. The victims are alive, the victims' families are alive, and they have not received any recognition. And the people who are doing this kind of work are truly oppressed and in danger of their lives. So I don't think there can be any conversation about reconciliation until we're able to talk about what happened. And this question about forgetting, who's going to forget? Who decides that? The victim will never forget, no matter if millions and billions of dollars are eventually paid. So this question itself, to me, it doesn't acknowledge the power imbalances between the victim. And I don't understand what kind of reconciliation you would have when an Armenian can't even go back to Turkey and claim his or her property and has to rely on this kind of works. Exactly the same thing. Palestinians can't even enter, they can't even go to their own country. So I'm not sure what that word means. I think in the colonial context, perhaps that can be a very interesting and fruitful conversation, but we're not in a post-colonial context in either of these two places. We're living in it. It is an ongoing tragedy that people in Palestine, Armenians of Turkey, the ex-Armenians of Turkey live through every day. So I feel quite strongly that this question of forgiveness, forgetting, reconciliation, firstly, has to come from those people, not from anybody else. And secondly, not yet.
I think I have something to say. I'm not entirely sure what this person means about forgetting. And I'm wondering if they mean, as we bring to the surface these erased people, events, properties, if we are then also suppressing other things. And I'm wondering if that might be where the post-colonial comes in the sense that, and this is not to explain away or apologize for the genocide, but the impetus for the genocide sprang from, and the denial of the genocide still springs from, a deeply held belief among many Turks of their victimization at the hands of colonial powers and the international power system at the time.
Christine, sorry, Christine, can you turn on your camera, or because your video?
I can.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, sorry about that. So yeah, I don't know if that's what the person's referring to, but I do think that that is an important piece of the story, that in this case, these events were all bound up. And that, I mean, that is, I believe, what prompted Ottomans and Turks to do these things, was their belief of their victimization in that larger arena. And it is worth discussing. It's worth trying to integrate that part of the story instead of, I don't know. I'm not someone who's into like a hierarchy of victimization, but there are multiple dynamics that were going on at the time. And I know Ümit is well aware of that. And so I just wonder if that's what that person's talking about, that there is another kind of forgetting that happens as we try to systematically kind of bring to the surface, exercise, document these forgotten events. So that's how I might start to answer that.
Yeah, I would also say that I don't know exactly what the questioner meant, but my understanding of reconciliation is that in order to have reconciliation, you need two elements, and neither of them works on their own. One is to acknowledge, that is to remember, but to remember also officially. So if you want reconciliation in terms of restitution, you first of all have to admit officially that something happened and what that something was, and to assume responsibility for it. The second is material. And as Alex was saying, the German government was willing to give some material compensation for the Herero from 1904, but didn't really want to say sorry. So it didn't want to take the moral responsibility. But it is the two components that need to, so it's not about forgetting, it's about remembering, but also remembering officially, not only personally. The reality of genocide, of course, is that it is always about erasure. It is always about taking first of all, erasing the people, and then erasing the property or owning it, and therefore changing what it is, and then also erasing the memory of the event itself. And so you cannot reverse that, but the first step you can do is to actually remember what was erased. And I think that's what the questioner was alluding to, but we don't have his response here. Ümit.
I mostly agree with what have been said regarding this matter forgetting. Maybe I can add the following. It's a matter. It's this acknowledgement, which to me will be unlikely in the case of Turkey or Armenian with regards to Armenian genocide. It's a matter of existence for Turkish state and Turkish society, because we usually attribute the power of the denialism from the state vantage point, but denialism in Turkey being reinforced and strengthened by different sections of society in Turkey. So this property issue here plays a key role, because it touches upon so many people and families who have no idea about what happened to Armenians actually, but all of a sudden, some guy like me comes up with that kind of book, which will be read maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people in the academic milieu, talking about, giving all these details, family names, surnames, their family ties and family background, and then the guy all of a sudden happened to learn that, oh, this property even does not belong to my great-grandfather. These people are not aware of that. I mean, as a large picture, they know, of course, they know, Armenians were here, this neighborhood, this used to be an Armenian quarter and so forth. But all these details, and for instance, I received a number of emails from the third generation offshoot of all these Turkish Muslim families, and they are telling me, my father bought this place from this guy, we paid this amount of money, what are you talking about, what a shame on you, I am going to sue you, stuff like that. But I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not fingering at anyone. It's like I'm trying to explain that this social historical process, this dynamics. And so that creates this existential problem, even every single person, individual, at very micro level, let alone the state. And this, so I mean, denialism is so huge, has so many dimensions. So actually, denialism, this kind of denialism aggravates Armenians, this negative sentiments, and which some of them might even turn into animosity. Of course, I'm talking about the hardliners, let's say. Like just as it happens in every society. So we cannot just say, okay, what happened in the past, it's just happened. I can't even say the same thing for what happened to Muslim people in the Balkans in 1913 and 1912 and 1913. Another critique, I don't even consider as a critique, but like an accusatory, let's say, claim. Oh, why don't you talk about what happened to Muslims in the Balkans? Nobody denies that. If I knew Bulgarian, Serbian, these kind of languages, I would have happy to work on this topic, So this is, I don't even know how to answer, because I think we should really be cautious and really respect to victims by using all these. We don't have any right to use even the word forget. Victims have right to use it if they use it. And victims, if they use it, other victims may be accusing of those victims. So that would create, maybe it's going to be a foxy issue for Turkey. They can use it like that, just engulf the whole conflicts among the Armenian society. But there was this Nietzsche's quote, he said, no matter how far or how fast he may run, the chain runs with him. It's something amazing. The moment, in one sudden motion there, in one sudden motion gone, before nothing, afterwards nothing, nevertheless comes back again as a ghost and disturbs the tranquility of a later moment. A leaf is continuously relieved from the roll of time, falls out, flutters away, and suddenly flutters back again into the man's lap. Or the man says, I remember.
Ümit, thank you so much.
He didn't say I forget, I remember.
I think this is the right moment to close this panel. We just arrived at the time, but thank you so much. Thank you, first of all, for writing the book. It's an outstanding book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for participating, and thank you to all the panelists, those who are with us and those who had to leave. And of course, thank you for our audience. And I believe this will be recorded, so those who missed it will be able to watch this on YouTube, I think. So thank you, and thank you to the Watson Institute for hosting this event. And I'll see you all soon.